So very warm welcome to all of you, be it here in the room, I hardly can see you, but also very warm welcome to those at home. I can't see you either, so I'm a lone person here, but very happy that you can join us this afternoon. I hope we all still have enough energy after a long day and so many interesting sessions. My name is Daniel Sauter. I'm located in Zurich, Switzerland, work from there. I'm a sociologist, and I have the great pleasure and privilege to moderate this session here on the monitoring impact of qualitative and quantitative data. We have 4 speakers with us this afternoon with very interesting presentations, I can already say. And we will split up the session in 2 parts. We have a first part where we talk about monitoring developments. That's with André de Witt from Rotterdam and with Benny Cullen from Ireland. And then we have a second session with the topic on understanding motivations with Suzanne McDonough and Fiona Chambers. She will join us online from Cork. I suggest we do a question and answer part after each part of these 2 and because one person didn't come now, we have a little bit more time. So hopefully, I still ask the presenters to be in time with the 12 minutes, but we hopefully have more time for discussion. So it's a great pleasure now for me to introduce you to the first speaker. It's André de Witt. He works as a mobility advisor at the Urban Development Department at the City of Rotterdam. And he's going to talk about In Search for the Pedestrian, steps towards the development of a pedestrian monitor. So André, please, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. I think this is the one from... Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Daniel, for introducing me, and thanks for the opportunity to have my presentation about this model. And actually, Daniel, yesterday you had a very good presentation yourself in a session which was called Wrestling with Data. Well, we wrestled with data in Rotterdam, and we won, I think, because I got a prize to prove it, but that will be later on. Well, we did it with a couple of persons we wrestled. 2 of them were working at Witteveen Bos, an engineering bureau. There's another one, an engineering bureau. And they were not able to come to this conference now. But it was very good to have him on board. We had an ambition a few years ago for walking Rotterdam Loopt, Rotterdam Walks, and one of the main goals was to do something with data and research. It was one of the best goals because data is lacking in Rotterdam with pedestrians, and sometimes we don't use data to get information from it. There's a possibility that we can. Like I said, data is lacking for the pedestrian. So when we change the pyramid from walking, we also have to data collection should also be translated in this pyramid. But the difficulty is that the pedestrian is diverse and he's innocent, and that makes him invisible. Rob Methorst, his thesis is one of his recommendations. We should make him more visible in public space, but also in data and statistics. So we did an attempt to do so. And why? Because what is the origin of traffic models? Traffic models were invented because to regulate capacity for cars. And it was used for city development. And the result was that a lot of the car infrastructure expanded. And the pedestrian was more or less reduced to extra waiting time for the car. You can see it in Dublin as well. A lot of the traffic lights have a very short green time, and that is because of these kind of models. So I think we did an attempt to change this, to make a pedestrian model that regulates our capacity for the pedestrians. So I asked Victor van der Bos, come with a method to find the current situation on walking in Rotterdam and come up with a sort of hierarchy in the pedestrian network. So which are the most dominant streets and which are the less dominant? And I asked them to use the pedestrian intensities with it. They came with this approach. 4 steps, collect pedestrian counts, examine, select significant street variables, and they create a prediction model from it, and they interpolated this to a model for the whole city center. I will take you to these 4 steps. I'm not an engineer, so maybe the technical part is a big challenge for me to explain. So I hope I get through it. We got a lot of pedestrian counts in the city center of Rotterdam, only the city center. So that's why we had to make a project boundary, that's the red line, to make a reliable image of all the streets in Rotterdam. If we have to do it for all of Rotterdam, we need more counting points, but that's for the future. So we had this. They were very happy with this. Then they did a lot of research to select all the factors that we know about that repel or are positive for pedestrians to come to a place, to a certain place. They also use space syntax for this. So when they collected all these variables, they were on these kind of themes. We were looking in our databases if we have these data available. So, and then after getting all these available variables and data, they tried to find out which variables were explained why pedestrians were in a certain place. So which variables can make a prediction of where pedestrians will be. And these were the most important variables that came out of the model. So the network closeness, so the amount of points you can go to in a 400-meter distance, the distance to a train station, the controlled crossing within 50 meters, they were all prediction of where you can find pedestrians. And from these two, from this cross-sectional method, they build up an algorithm, and from this algorithm they extrapolated a map for the whole city center. Now, so here you see again all the lines that are we use for this network stuff, and this is in the end the image they come up with. So the yellow lines are the lines where we can find the most pedestrians, and the purple lines are the lines where you can find the least. So this is now, and it's not 100% accurate, but it's an image that you build up in a systematic way. So not only on the expert view, but that's normally what we do. Where you can expect to find the people. Well, you say that if you ask to one people, they say, well, we took these lines and these lines and these streets and these ways, these boulevards. But this is a systematic approach to get a whole image for the city center. And because I want to use this in a sort of strategic way, because we don't know exactly if these yellow lines are accessible, or if these lines have enough benches. But we reverse it, we turn around. We say a yellow line is very important for pedestrians, so check if there is enough benches. Check if there is enough accessibility. If you're doing maintenance, make a good, how do you call it? Detour, yeah. So because that's why we want to use it at a strategic level. Because otherwise we are constantly getting data on accessibility, and now we turn it around. We say, this is a yellow line, make it accessible. And also, the purple lines can there's a question mark for us. Are they really that bad? Are they really so bad for the pedestrians? Or maybe we can do something about it that they're quite good for them. So this is the way in which we want to try and use this map. This is another example. Like I said, we got a prize. There was a national congress on traffic engineering and on transport planning, and we were awarded the second prize. And the second prize, especially because of don't see a lot of these kind of methods being developed for transport planning. So that was the main argument to give us this prize. So maybe it's not that accurate, but it's a good attempt to use pedestrian intensities and street characteristics to make a whole image for the city. Like I said, applications. We now have a map we can show to traffic engineers, designers, of where you can expect and find the most pedestrians. We can also use it for what if impact analysis. If you adjust a lot of buildings, the pattern changes. If you add a public transport station, it also changes. So that's all things you can do with this model. The next steps, we want to upgrade it to a city scale, and therefore we need a pedestrian counting strategy. And your work was very nice to hear about, because we're thinking about the same way. And our first advice on these strategies, I think we need about 100 counting points in the city to build up an entire map for the city. So still 100 points it's still a lot, but it's not that much if you can make a whole image for the entire city. And you can do it in a year's time. It doesn't have to be in 1 week. And especially in what moment you have to count. It was what you're talking about. It's Tuesday. That we're still figuring out. So your work is very interesting. But that is what we are now doing. Also, policy development. The new coalition in Rotterdam is thinking about a circulation plan. So we say, well, we have a circulation plan now for the pedestrian. We didn't have that a year ago. So again, it's a sort of strategic way to put the pedestrian and make him visible. And that is exactly what we're trying to do. Also, when you're restructuring a street, it can be helpful. Area development, you see Rijnhaven. We're going to build a lot of new households over there. So what does it do with the infrastructure? What do we need? Well, 2 minutes, then you got some extra time. And also maintenance and upkeeping. You can also say, normally every street is being done in 10 years' time in Rotterdam. But you can also say, if some streets, the yellow streets, are mostly used by pedestrians, so maybe we should do it every 5 years. Exactly the pavement. Or maybe we should check the benches more. Or maybe reinforcement as well. Because one of the big problems in Holland is parked bikes. So we can ask reinforcement, go and check the bikes, because this line is needed for pedestrians. So then again, you get action from other departments in your city. No, these were some discussion points, but we can use them later maybe. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andre. Very interesting, and I think the potential is really huge of what you suggest, as you say. So we'll get into that in more detail, hopefully engaged in the discussion. Thanks very much, and please have a seat again, and we'll ask our second speaker and have the Q&A after. It's Dr. Benny Cullen. He's Director of Research and Innovation at Sport Ireland. and he will be talking about a decade of walking behavior in Ireland, 2011 to 2021. What changes have occurred, and what will be the next years? What will the next 10 years look like? So we're very curious.
Daniel, and well done, Andre. That was really interesting. I'm looking forward to some discussion on that. To begin with, I'm not a doctor. I think there was a typo in the but I am an engineer. I'm relatively unapologetic for being an engineer, and you might get a sense of that from the presentation I'm going to give you. So yeah, I'm Director of Research and Innovation at Sport Ireland. You would have heard from my colleague Una May yesterday. Sport Ireland have done a lot of work in the development of especially recreational walking in Ireland. And so I'm going to talk you through a kind of a population monitoring data source that we've had in Ireland for over 10 years now. It's called the Irish Sports Monitor. It's a random digit dialing survey of the entire Irish population over the age of 16. It's carried out biannually. It started in 2007, but the data I'm going to show you is from 2011 onwards up to 2021. We get about 8,500 respondents a year, about 700 respondents a month, so it's rolled out throughout the entire year. It means we have margin of error plus or minus 1% on the data that we capture on population behaviours. We capture data both on walking for transport and walking for recreation. But just to give a bit of a spin on this particular topic, I'm going to talk about the walking for recreation. Because in Ireland, more people walk for recreation than walk for transport. And I think it's important to consider that at times. This is the question that we report on. I'd like to ask you about any recreational walking you did in the last 7 days. Do not include walks for transport, such as walking to work or the shops, but do include walks undertaken for leisure or recreation. In the last 7 days, did you undertake such a walk? How many walks did you undertake? For how long did you walk? And how would you describe your walking pace? So we're measuring duration, frequency, and intensity, and also where do you usually walk? I've only got 12 minutes, about 24 slides of data to show you. So I'm only going to report on 2 questions. And this, anybody who does research, kind of one of our observations is that if you deal with lots of measures, you get a very superficial analysis. And you're actually, my recommendation, we deal with small numbers of measures and go really deep. And really get in there to understand the problem, because otherwise you're just scratching the surface. So 24 slides. I'm going to be speaking quickly. Hold on to your hats, hold on to your questions, and here we go. So this is 10 years of walking data in Ireland. On the x-axis there on the bottom, you have years 2011 all the way up to 2021. On the vertical axis, you have millions of walkers, millions of people in Ireland walking. And the blue line or the greenish line you see there is the population prevalence of walking. So what we see is that the numbers of people walking in Ireland has been continually increasing between 2011 and 2021, with a big spike in 2020. At one stage, we had 78%. I think it actually peaked in one of the quarters in 2020 at 83% of the population had walked for recreation in the last 7 days. We are a nation of leisure walkers. There's no doubt about it in Ireland. What you see, though, is that prevalence rate dipped between 2011 and 2015 and then rose again to 2019 and the peaks in COVID. And I might touch on that a little bit later because I think it raises lots of questions. What happened? Why did it dip? Why did the population prevalence dip? So that's the history. I'm now going to try and give you a bit of a picture of the present. So who are walkers? What do they look like? Who are these people? So this is the age profile of walkers in Ireland. It's taken on average data between 2015, 2017, 2019. It increases our sample size and gives us better accuracy on these demographic characteristics. So on average, about 65% of the population walking, just shy of 2.5 million people. And what you see is that older people are more likely to walk than younger people. Although there are still high prevalence rates of walking between 16 and 24-year-olds, those who are aged 35 to 55 are more likely to walk. And you see on the right-hand side here some estimates on the numbers of people in each of those age groups. We've 500,000 people aged between 35 and 44 walking, and 450,000 between 45 and 54. So you kind of get, if you were to look at a population of walkers at random, you would see a lot of people in that age cohort. More women walk for recreation than men in Ireland. It's not the case with all sports and physical activities. Indeed, it's relatively rare. And some things that we measure in other areas of sport is things like whether having children, having played sport or being active at school, or whether your parents were active, have an influence on your physical activity behaviours. In most sports and physical activities, they do. In walking, they don't. So walking is somewhat independent of your childhood experiences, of the cross-generational impact, and indeed of whether you have children or not, which is interesting. We're also very interested in disability gradients. Those with a disability are less likely to walk for recreation than those who don't have a disability. Albeit the difference there is about 5 percentage points. But because the prevalence rate is relatively high in both populations, the odds ratio of walking, whether you have a disability or not, is not all that great. We're also interested in the socioeconomic status of these walkers. We see this in all physical activity in Ireland. I think it's a phenomenon that is worldwide. Those from lower socioeconomic classes are less likely to be physically active. They're less likely to walk for recreation. We've something interesting in Ireland. We capture data on farmers, independent of socioeconomic data. They're the least likely to walk of all the populations. Somebody can ask me a question about that later on if you're interested in learning more. And we're also interested in the location, whether there's different walking prevalence across different locations. So those living in Dublin, in the urban areas, and the rest of Leinster, and for those of you who live in Ireland, you'll understand Connacht, which is out west, they kind of have similar prevalence rates of walking. But those who live in Munster, in the south of the country, walk more. I actually don't know why, but they're statistically more likely to walk more. And those living in Ulster, up in the northern end of Ireland, are more likely to walk less or less likely to walk, which will be of interest to Suzanne. Okay, the last dimension on this present kind of analysis is where are people walking? And I was talking to Andre about this early on. We only started asking this question in 2017. But what you see is, just shy of 1.5 million people walking on local roads in 2017, about 500,000 in parks, and just shy of 250,000 in forest trails and beach or seafront. We flicked to 2019, and I had this in my speaking notes, but I'm going to give you the general kind of observation here. The prevalence of walking, the numbers of people walking on local roads reduces. But the number of people walking in parks, seafronts, and forest trails increases. And so what we see when we measure at a population level is that if you build really good infrastructure, there are some new people coming to walk on that infrastructure, but there's a lot of displaced behavior. So people were walking where they could on their local roads, on public footpaths, then they moved to parks and trails. So trying to understand what that split is between people who are taking up activity versus people who are just shifting the location of their activity is of great interest to us. Okay, we've looked at the past, we've looked at the present. I'm looking at Daniel to figure out how I'm doing on time, but hopefully we're all right. We should be about halfway through. Good stuff. So the next part, and this is the really exciting part for us, and it's kind of, I think we're at the frontier of trying to do some smart stuff in Sport Ireland, but we're really interested in the future. This came from consultation with the practitioners we work with. They said, yeah, look, at the past is kind of interesting, and the present, yeah, there's a bit of a so what. Tell us about the future. That'll get us excited. That'll get us thinking. So we try and build this under kind of 4 kind of basic steps. The first thing is we try to build assumptions of how physical activity, in this case recreational walking, might actually progress over time. How does it change over time? We then overlay that on future population projections of the Irish population. We try and identify what challenges that might raise, and indeed what the influence on recreational walking will be over time. So on the assumptions end, stick with me with this gets a little complex. What we try to do is we follow age groups of the population. So in this case, you have 3 lines here, 16 to 19-year-olds, 20 to 24-year-olds, and 25 to 34-year-olds. And we track their level of walking over time. Remember that dip in walking between 2015 and 2011 and 2015, that dip in prevalence? What you see here is the dark green line. 25 to 34-year-olds were one of the big drivers of that dip in prevalence. So what we can see is we can look at the same age group over time. Because we've 10 years of data, the other thing we can do is we can look at these 16 to 24-year-olds on the left-hand side, and we can look at the 25 to 34-year-olds 10 years later. So although these are cross-sectional analysis of the population, we're sampling from the same population group. So what we can see is that the 16 to 25-year-olds increased their rate of walking as they got older. And that kind of helps us to understand how walking develops in the population and what assumptions we can bake into the models of future walking behaviors. And then we can do the same thing with the next age cohorts, 35-year-olds all the way down to 65-plus-year-olds. You'll notice here the purple line, which is the 55 to 64-year-olds, there's also that dip to 2015. So we're 2 big age cohorts there that dipped while the other age cohorts didn't. And that creates, these are statistically significant observations. So that creates questions for us. What happened in those age groups? And actually, what is really driving walking behavior here? And it's kind of part of a big socio-economic construct, really, that it's not just dependent on things like infrastructure and programming, but it's also dependent on economic circumstances within the country. And if anybody wants to ask a question later, I might get a few minutes to answer it. And again, here, just to show that we can track, the same samples over time. So looking at, in this case, we can look at the 45 to 54-year-olds in 2011, and then look at them when they're 55 to 64, 10 years later. We're sampling from the same cohort. Okay, So that allows us to build in assumptions of how walking builds over time. And then we have to overlay that on top of the progression of the Irish population, how the population changes over time. So this is the Irish population in 2021, just shy of 5 million people over the age of 16. You see two big things. First of all, we have a huge number of the population in the 40 to 44-year-old age cohort, probably 35 to 54. It's my generation. I'm smack bang in the middle there. And we've this second cohort, aged between 5 and 15. So there are 30% less 20-year-olds than there are 40-year-olds in Ireland. And there are 20% more 10-year-olds than there are 20-year-olds. So we're going to have this big transition, this big shift over time. If we go forward 10 years, you can see these cohorts of the population changing. You can see that the 40 to 44-year-old bracket has dropped by 20%. And you can see them being replaced by this future generation that is transitioning through. And these age profiles of the population have huge impacts in terms of infrastructure and behaviors of the population. Okay, and then we can project out to 2051. It's a European phenomenon, the idea of the aging population. We all think it is older people that are this aging population issue. It's my generation. We were 40 to 44. In 30 years' time, we're 70 to 74, and there is loads of us. There is millions of us. And that's going to be a problem. So we are the problem generation. So we combine our assumptions with the population projections, and we try and build a profile of walking in the present and walking in the future. So this is modeling. So it's not exactly spot on to where we are right now, but if we imagine in 2021, we're just shy of 4 million people in the population, just over 2.5 million walkers, and a prevalence of about 65%. What you can see is that the walking population is relatively well distributed from 15 to 24-year-olds to 65-plus-year-olds. So this is the number of people in each age group. As we project into the future, 2031, the population has gone up to 4.5 million. From 4 million, number of walkers has gone up from 2.5 million to almost 3 million. We're still at 65% prevalence rate. So the prevalence rate of walking hasn't gone up, but the number of walkers has increased significantly. And keep an eye over the right-hand side. Those over the age of 65 have increased quite a bit. We project out to 20 years' time, nearly 5 million people in the population, over 3 million walkers, 3.2 million walkers, big growth in the number of walkers, no growth in the prevalence rate of walking. And so this is really important because policy objectives are set on prevalence rates. They're not set on numbers of people. And you can see in the 65-plus age bracket, 850,000 walkers. And out to 2051, you see the same trend. Prevalence rates staying the same, numbers of walkers increasing, and the profile of walkers, 1 million walkers over the age of 65. So the kind of infrastructure we're building now, which is likely to be in place in 30 years' time, needs to consider that actually, if you go back to 2021, we're going from 500,000 walkers over the age of 65 to 1 million walkers over the age of 65. So what kind of infrastructure are these people going to be walking on, and what are their preferences in that walking infrastructure? The very last thing that we do then, we try to raise challenges to policy and government, and we like to be disruptive, I suppose. It's the nature of what we do, and we try and raise questions. I was saying to Andre early on, I don't think the data answers anything, but it helps us to understand what questions we should be asking. So it helps us to dig deeper. So this is the National Physical Activity Plan projection of a 1% growth of physical activity per year going forward. Now, I've plotted it out for 30 years with compound interest. That gets very big over time, but it's set out to 2027 and maybe beyond. What we can do is we can overlay our models onto that. So if we overlay the reasonable model that we might expect of growth and walking based on past growth and on the components of the future population, what we see is that even 2030, we're very likely to fall short of that 1% growth objective. So even though the number of walkers is increasing, and if you're using counters or you're measuring programs, you'd be like, this is great, we've more people walking, and this is great, the numbers are growing. Growth may not be growth in and of itself because of this government objective that's set in percentage of populations rather than absolute numbers of people. That's it from me. Hopefully I'm okay on the time, Daniel, and then look forward to any questions. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Benny. And can I just ask you to sit here for a moment, both of you? Yeah, Andre as well. Very interesting. And I do like that we have tools that you both suggested that allow us predictions into the future. Because very often we hang on there and asking ourselves, what do we have to design? What do you have to plan for the future? And you suggest two tools, but I would first want to open the floor for questions from your side before I ask any questions myself. So do you have any questions to Andre or to Benny? Okay, I'll start here on the left.
So from left to Hi, if I'm allowed to ask questions about qualitative rather than quantitative. So you talked about the research that was done for Rotterdam. Have you done any research with citizens that asks them about their attitudes to walking? Because clearly you talked about having 100 data points to capture the amount of walking, which is clearly very important to understand, so your yellow lines. But have you triangulated that with evidence from citizens about their walking and their walking habits and how much they do, and maybe the reasons for their walking? Obviously, walking in the city centre is probably related to shopping, but there are other reasons. We know recreation is very important too. So it's just triangulating data together to actually get a better overall picture in order to develop the plan moving forward.
Well, we did a survey in 2019. We asked the citizens of Rotterdam where they like or dislike to walk. And we also used that as a layer in this model as well. So we integrated some of the subjective data we had. But it was a survey was really dominant in the north part of Rotterdam. So, and it was less people from Rotterdam South. So it's not really reliable, but we use it as sort of underlay for the city centre. So.
I think there was a question here. Yes, please. Go ahead.
My question's for Benny. I was wondering how your sampling or how it changed with changing phone habits. You mentioned it was, yeah.
So I mentioned that the research started in 2007. What happened was the methodology changed in 2011 because we did take account of the growing number of mobile phones in the population. And so that's why I didn't go back to the 2007 data, because there is changes in methodology, and so we can't be 100% confident of that continuity. But since 2011, the methodology has been robust and been the same. The only thing is that the percentage, so in terms of that sampling strategy, the percentage of mobile phones within the strategy has increased over time. So we work with the provider who does the phone surveys for us to ensure that we're getting good representative sampling across both landline and mobile phone coverage.
And you just, sorry, I've just follow up. And the age cohorts that are responding, you don't have to. Has that been a challenge for you? Because we've been finding that just the younger people don't answer their phones when you do.
Yeah. I mean, you end up with quite large sampling frames in a way, because people don't answer, and especially with scam calls nowadays, people are more reluctant to answer and engage. But the providers, they give us all that data, and it's kind of part of the challenge of no matter what methodology you go at. We're doing another project on a community level, and the question on the qualitative piece. Really, if you really want to get down into it, it's door-to-door surveys is the way to go, where you're knocking on people's doors, not too dissimilar to what the minister was talking about. And you get a more representative sample in that approach. Especially, and it's not so much the age profile, but it's the socioeconomic profile. The people from lower socioeconomic communities are less likely to engage in those kind of methodologies. But that said, we weight the sample, and because the sample size is relatively large, we're quite confident that it is quite representative of the sample that's out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please, Suzanne.
So these are for Benny. So my questions are, yes, why do you not include walk transport?
We do. No, so we ask questions on walking for transport and walking for recreation. I only had 12 minutes in the presentation. So I stuck with the walking for recreation just because I thought it'd bring a different slant, and it's so popular in Ireland. I think it's worth highlighting. This is a massive piece of activity in the walking space. We do have walking for transport questions in the survey as well. It's another 12-minute presentation. If you guys want to hang around for another 12 minutes, we can.
And I have another question. I'm a physio by background, so this is why I'm interested in this. How are you defining disability when you're asking that question?
So we run a survey with children, and we use really validated measures. It's like a 10 measure, but it's a paper survey. Over the phone, you're limited to how many questions you can ask people that they'll tolerate. I'm trying to remember the exact word. We asked them 2 questions. One question is, do you have any disability or long-term illness that influences your daily activity? And then we asked about how that influences their sporting and physical activity behavior specifically. So we measured in a kind of a relatively broad question.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
So I think the physical activity guidelines in Ireland is just over like the 34-35%, and yet you've really high percentages of people walking. So
yeah.
I just wonder, have you thought about that apparent mismatch between people walking but not meeting the guidelines.
Yeah, it's another 12-minute presentation if you want them, but we do have data on intensity, frequency, and duration. So what I was presenting on, this is back to the idea of using simple measures and digging deep. And then with each measure, you got to dig really deep. I was measuring the occurrence of walking. So people who've walked at least once in the last 7 days. We've got frequency, so we can check, okay, how many days in the last 7 days have they walked? We've got duration, we've got intensity, which lets us know whether their walking is at moderate or vigorous intensity that allows them to raise their heart rate and get the health benefits. So yeah, we have all that, but it's hard to squeeze it all in.
Okay, thanks very much, thank you.
Do you have a report that people could...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So the Irish Sports Monitor, if you Google Irish Sports Monitor, you'll find our reports, they're publicly available, and they go into a good bit more depth on all of those elements. But even the report is limited into how deep it can go because we measure so many variables.
Is there any other questions? No, I have two questions. One is, how do you, and I start with Benny as well, how do you define the recreational? Is that including like hiking, or is that, because you mentioned like local roads, so not so much hiking paths, just to understand, what all do you include?
So so this is a telephone survey, and I gave you the wording. That's the exact wording that the surveyor asked. I can't remember exactly what it is off the top of my head, but I'd now like to ask you some questions about recreational walking. Don't include walks to shops so we kind of exclude the walking for transport, and then we give some examples. I can't remember exactly what they were in there, but you can include walks for leisure with family, and maybe we included hiking in parks or something like that. But it's the exact wording that I gave you at the start. So it's kind of a definition by exclusion of walking for transport, as opposed to trying to list all the possible recreational walking options.
But do people realize, like, sort of, how do you make sure that the consistency is the same? That not some people think of some things and others think of other things.
So there's a follow-up question. So that question is specifically around walking. We define it as best we can in terms of defining recreational walking. We do have a follow-up question about other sports and physical activities that people do. So the following question, that's really, to be honest, that's where our main domain of work is. And some people do register hiking as a sport rather than a walking activity, and we capture them in hiking. So we end up having to then merge data sets to go, okay, well, the hiking data set is actually part of the recreational walking data set. So we do a bit of work on that too.
Okay, thank you. Similar question to you. You mentioned the destinations that were sort of as an input data. What all do you consider as a destination? Like what was included in that?
Shops were included, public transport was included. I think there some cultural theaters and everything, they were also included. And they were quite predictive for the amount of people you expect in the street. So they came out as well as one.
And the number of people living there, like I imagine that was also part, because in some industrial areas, I noticed there was hardly any traffic volume in terms of pedestrians.
So also the amount of the buildings is also one of the variables that are very explain why people are there.
Right. And you mentioned the benches as a qualitative aspect of what you might look at. Is there other qualitative aspects like trees and garbage bins and all these things that you combine the data with already now, or is that planned in the future?
Well, I don't know the list, but benches I know, trees as well. All this other stuff I don't really know if you did, and we don't have the data on that always. Also, we have data about the zebra crossings. That's also we also had it in the survey.
So that's very fine grain, really.
So, and like I said, it's more of you can use it in a strategic way, because like I said, in those yellow lines, you can reverse it and say, well, if people want to cross over there, we have extra green time for the pedestrian when there's a crossing. So you can reverse what normally happened was the pedestrian was reduced as waiting time for the car. Now we say, that's a claim for us. We can claim the public space in those streets. We can claim our waiting time for or green time for traffic lights. So that's the way you want to use it.
It really changes the mindset.
It really changes the mindset. And still we have to work on the models to make it better. That's what we're doing. But the way you want to use it, that's the big message, that you reverse the thinking.
Super, very interesting. Both of your presentations. Thank you very much. A round of applause for the two presenters, please. And please have a seat again, and we'll continue.
Before we leave, just acknowledge one thing, Dean, because I think, so, this projection of kind of the, physical activity plan projections and what the models might do. A question we frequently get asked is, well, how could we meet the objectives of the National Physical Activity Plan? I'd just like to give credit to Minister Ryan, who was speaking earlier on, because the kind of thing that might reach those kind of objectives is the huge increase we've had in the active transport budget since 2020, and I think that's a credit to their work. But to go from 1 or 2% to 20% of the active transport, that is the scale of work, of investment, of resources. I think that's required to meet the kind of ambitions that government are setting out. So just to recognise that I think it's a really good step. And I think other policy areas can learn from that and go, if you're setting these objectives, you need really big resourcing behind that.
And that makes it difficult to project then in the future, because if they are cutting it back or increasing it, there might be some effects on
well, the nice thing is that we're now at a stage where we can start baking that stuff into assumptions. We can talk to departments and go, okay, well, you're making this investment. What area of the population are you targeting? What kind of behaviours? What do you think this will be the impact? And we can put that into the model now and model it forwards. The nice thing about that as well is it then hopefully helps to secure the investment, because you go, okay, well, if you're taking that investment, we have to change the model. So you're no longer going to meet your policy target because you're reducing. So it's a virtuous circle, it reinforces itself.
Exactly. And there's one more element, and we're coming now to that. That's the motivations.
Great.
And so we're having the next presentation by Professor Suzanne McDonough, and she's a professor of health and rehabilitation in RCSI, School of Physiotherapy here in Dublin. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, please correct me.
Yeah.
And the title of your presentation is Walking for Health, a Walking for Health study with reflections on the delivery of a feasibility randomized controlled trial of an intervention to increase physical activity and reduce sedentary behavior with severe mental illness. Sounds very interesting. Sorry, I didn't learn that by heart, but it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank
you. Pleasure to listen to you.
Right,
Thank you.
Sorry, my title's a bit of a mouthful there. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I have been doing walking interventions. I'm a physiotherapist, and I've been doing walking interventions with different patient groups now probably for about 20 years. So it's brilliant to come to a conference like this, which is sort of intersectoral. And what I'd like to think is that what we're doing is we're helping probably the most medicalized parts of the community to have the confidence and the skill set to actually join all these community initiatives that are happening out there. So, I forgot about here it is, the pointer. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about background as to why we're doing this study. So this is a feasibility study, so it's really to find out whether we could do a larger trial. And we're working with people with severe mental illness. So this is people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and major depression. And many of these people have cognitive challenges, and they have lots and lots of barriers to being active and tend to be very sedentary. I'll talk a little bit more about this. This population have an increased risk of physical health problems. So you can see in the slide here, their increased risk of all the major diseases. And there in Ireland, it's estimated there are 3,000 additional deaths every year in this population because of physical health disorders. And it's partly explained by their medication that they're on, but also in their lifestyle behaviours. And maybe just to explain a little bit of my motivation, my sister is a psychiatrist, and we've spent, probably about 5 or 6 years discussing what we could do to try and improve the physical health of her population, because they tend to be treated quite siloed. So we know from the physical activity guidelines that many in the general population don't meet them. People with severe mental illness are much more likely to not meet them, and they're also much more likely to be sedentary. So when you have conversations with these individuals, they have days in bed, where they could literally be lying in bed all day, and that's pretty typical for their patterns of behavior. So what do we know about recommendations for this population? Currently, what's recommended is actually supervised exercise classes. And that's fine, because if it helps with their mental health symptoms, that's great. But they don't necessarily help someone to be active for the long term. So that's why we're really interested in looking at walking as a different strategy. When you look at the evidence for walking in this population, there's actually very little evidence out there. And on the other side, I mean, I know we've heard, for example, we heard about quilture, we've heard about the walks in nature for people with mental health problems. There's a lot of that activity goes on. When you actually look at the research, there's actually very little published research in it. And there's very little published research that actually upskills the individual to have the skills to be more active. So without the groups. So that's really where we're focusing our efforts on. Also in the literature, there's very little on actual whether walking can actually improve mental health symptoms or actually improve their physical activity levels. So our aim then was to test the feasibility of this, what we're calling a health coaching intervention. It's really a behaviour change intervention that we trained up community mental health teams to deliver with an aim to increase physical activity and reduce sedentary behaviour. And because it's a feasibility study where we're trying to find out whether it works, we're really interested in whether we could recruit people into the study, could we retain them, what was their satisfaction level. So we did lots of qualitative work. And then we do have a little bit on outcomes. And if you ask me at the end, I'll be able to give you some indication about the direction of our results. But our study is just sort of in the final stages of recruitment at the moment. So this is the flow diagram of our study. So we are recruiting people with an SMI who weren't currently active. And the community mental health team identified whether they were suitable to take part in our study. And then they were randomized either into an intervention group, which involved an education session, a wearable device. We used the Mi Band device, a step diary, and then they had coaching sessions. So these were either in person or by telephone every second week over a 13-week period. And then the control group got an education session and written information about the benefits of being more active. And then I've probably touched already on the outcomes, but maybe just to tell you a little bit, we measured the changes in physical activity and sedentary behaviour with an Exhibity device. So some of you might be familiar with that. That's used in the UK Biobank. So it's a wrist-worn device, black box device to measure changes in physical activity. So here's a little bit more about the intervention components. So as a motivational tool, we use the Mi Band. So obviously they got feedback on the amount of activity they were doing. They were able to use that alongside their coach to set step goals. They also used the sedentary alert, the idle alert on it for their sedentary behaviour. And then, as I say, every second week, they had a coaching session from this, what we're calling the clinician coach, who was either an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist within their team. And then our intervention was designed around behaviour change components. So looking at, these have shown to be effective in the general population. So looking at goal setting, action coping planning, and really supporting the person to problem solve. So identify what might be the barriers that would prevent them from being active and having those solutions in place up front. So we started, just to give you a bit of background, we started this trial and within 6 months we had COVID. It was supposed to be a face-to-face intervention, so we had to pretty much change everything that we did. This was not supposed to be a remote, it wasn't necessarily supposed to be a remotely delivered intervention. But because COVID continued on, we had to change it fundamentally. So we went from recruiting everybody in person to having to do telephone recruitment to doing all our outcome assessments were in person to do them remotely. And the actual intervention delivery all went remote as well. So just to give you some initial findings then, we recruited and randomized 54 people. We had a small number of dropouts, but that's pretty typical in studies like this. But the intervention adherence was really high. So between 85 to 100% adherence with the core intervention components. So we were really happy with this, particularly given that we were working with some of this population of a lot of cognitive challenges, and we were doing this at a distance with them. So trying to teach them how to use the device, basically over the phone or by video call. We interviewed 20 of the participants in the study. And what has emerged really is that there were two really key motivating factors. One was the Mi Band. They absolutely loved it. And these were a lot of people who wouldn't have access to a wearable. So, this is a population, again, where we had funding to buy them shoes if they didn't have shoes. So they're quite a deprived part of the population. So that was really important, and we let them hold on to the knee band at the end of the study. And then the second thing was the coach, and really how the coach helped them both with goal setting, but also action coping planning and identifying barriers and identifying strategies to overcome those barriers, and also for accountability moving forward. So just to finish off then, and I don't know where I am with time, but I'm obviously guessing that I've loads of time left, but we interviewed both the participants and the clinicians, and overall our feedback was all really positive. So we got a neutral person to do the focus groups of the interview, so someone who wasn't involved at all. So we tried to make sure our questions were really neutral, and we were really pleased about the positive feedback. I suppose maybe one thing to point out was we recruited in waves, and at the end of every wave we had feedback, and if there was an issue, we resolved things before we did the next wave. So I think that helped us also. So we iterated as we progressed through the study. Some things we had to drop because of COVID. So we did have a group-based walk, but we obviously had to lose that with COVID. And some participants really missed that social aspect of things. We've definitely identified that maintenance going forward is really important. And this is where we'd like to have conversations with other agencies that have walking groups that we can basically signpost these people to, because that's going to be really important to support them long term. In one way, COVID was a bit of a nightmare, but actually also was really good, because what we've been able to show is that we could deliver this intervention completely remotely, and it worked really well despite some of our reservations. But it did take a little bit more time, and some people needed some additional support. And then the final thing is, and this probably is not going to be no surprise to this audience, but when you speak to clinicians where they're used to giving supervised group-based exercise classes, pushing moderate to vigorous physical activity levels, which a lot of patients don't particularly like, and they don't particularly identify with this idea of doing exercise. Something like walking is much more acceptable. And this idea, that's why I was asking you about, counting all of the walking that people do. So, whether it's the short walk, the extra little bit you do when you get off at the bus stop one stop earlier, all of those things make a difference, particularly in this population. And that for many of them, it was the preferred type of activity. And then I just want to finish by thanking our funder. So this was actually funded by SEUPB, which is the Special European Union Programme Body funder. It was a north-south of Ireland collaboration. And I want to thank all of the participants for taking part in the study, and also the community mental health teams who we trained up to actually deliver the intervention. And I've got my details there if anybody has questions after the event. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Very interesting and very important, I think, to have the mental illness addressed, and the making walking available to everyone, even the deprived people. So we'll be discussing this after. We're going to be joined by Fiona. If are you online here, Fiona?
Yes.
Hello.
I am. Hi.
Yes, and we can hear you. Fiona Chambers, she's the head of education at the University of College of Cork, and she will be talking to us about the impact of the community-based program on participants' daily lives. So, Fiona, you have the floor.
Sorry, Daniel, there's a really bad echo at the moment. I hope people can hear me clearly, and yeah, hopefully so. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully that will work fine for everybody. And I'd be grateful if everybody could just tell me that they can actually see that clearly, please. So I'm assuming everybody can see that. And if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to begin straight away. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for the opportunity for presenting at this amazing conference. And somebody called out the fact that it was so interdisciplinary and intersector, which makes it wildly exciting for me to be presenting here, because I firmly believe that that is absolutely the way forward in promoting physical activity. So in relation to this presentation, you can see a combination of people listed here. Basically, it was a collective effort to try and get communities moving, to get communities walking. And I want to thank sincerely the Cork Kerry Community Healthcare group under Caroline Kelleher, who actually funded this particular initiative in 2 communities in Cork. And I'll speak a bit more clearly about that as we move forward. So this is the Mahon group, and you can see that there's multiple generations in this group. And that's what made it very exciting for us, that we were reaching so many different age groups, albeit in the one cohort. And we also had a group, not just in this urban setting, but also in a rural setting. And that was in the Mallow area, which is outside Cork. So what I will talk to you about now for the next 12 minutes or so, or less now, is how did Community Made to Move actually come about? The methodology that we used to try and check, was it actually working? And then some final comments and future directions for where we might go with it, and see where we might take it next. So in terms of the genesis of Made to Move, I'm just going to speak just very briefly about the motivation for a university to actually lead out on something like that. And what we call the Boyer model of scholarship is about really what the universities should be doing. And that is this idea that our teaching and the discovery work that we do around societal problems, the fact that we integrate disciplines and we try and apply really interesting innovations in the community, speaks directly to what we are supposed to be doing as a university. And that is effectively the community engagement aspect. So that's the driver for why we do this. The second driver for why we wanted to get involved in something which was encouraging more physical activity, albeit very much central to what I do in my day job, is the Kazan Action Plan, and the idea that we have 7 sustainable development goals that actually underpin and give us maybe some direction on the wicked problems that are currently facing the world in relation to sport and physical activity. So the question that drove everything that we did in this project was, how might we design an evidence-based physical activity program based on self-determination theory to increase physical activity levels among people in Ireland? And we saw that as a super wicked problem. We saw it as highly complex and systemic in nature. And you can see it's down the right-hand side of this continuum in terms of how difficult it is to try and fix something like that. So we turned to design thinking as being the superpower that might actually help us. And we worked for the past 4 to 5 years on developing Made to Move, which basically comes from the premise that all humans are designed to move. And now this further iteration of Community Made to Move, where we started to move outside the walls of the university and into the community. What we believe is that design thinking is a paradigm. And that means that when we talk about design thinking, it actually speaks directly to wicked problems. So that's essentially the worldview. The way we engage in reasoning is abductive. It's highly iterative. It is data informed. And it is something that is it's very nuanced, and it is based on educated guesses, albeit underpinned by data. And finally, the piece where it has a resonance with the context in which people are living. So in designing this particular initiative, we were really, really focused very heavily on the end users who might enjoy this at the end of the day. So they were part of the design of it, and then they obviously enjoyed the fruits of what we created. When we were engaged in the design of this particular initiative, we basically used 3 enabling factors, and they were the mindset, the design thinking mindset, the process, and also empowering learning spaces. Mindset, effectively, if I was to call it out in a couple of words, is all about empathy. It's about taking risks. It's about being consciously creative. And it's also about being happy with cognitive diversity. The process that we followed when we were designing Community Made to Move was a 6-stage process, and that is basically the Hasso-Plattner Institute model, which has been research informed and validated. So we can read a lot on that area just to check that out. There's 80% of the time we spent in the problem space figuring out what was the issue that was preventing people from walking, and what was the, I suppose, the solution space then was 20% of our time, which is maybe the opposite to what we would normally do as people when we're faced with a sticky problem. In terms of the learning spaces, we tried to create spaces which were very democratic. They were enabling spaces. They were a source of stimulation, etc. As you can see in the bottom square here, and Thoring and colleagues in 2018 called these out as really pivotal in an innovation space. In terms of the research design for Made to Move, we followed those 6 bubbles from the Hasso-Plattner Institute model for design thinking. And they were a really nice backbone or spine to the programme. And in terms of the design thinking itself, you can see that we used varying techniques to gather data and insights as we moved through the process. I'm going to remind you again that it's highly iterative. It's not as though we're on a train with 6 carriages on that train and we just keep moving to the end point. We went backwards and forwards and we gained insights and data points all the way through it. So you can see that in the understand bubble, we used semantic analysis, stakeholder mapping. We gathered insights through interviews, and we also crystallized some of the ideas that we were hearing through empathy mapping and journey mapping. Then we moved into the solution zone, where we had many provocations, anchor questions, and we really settled into trying to gather as many ideas as possible that could possibly answer the point of view that we were faced with. And we went to a prototyping phase where we had multiple prototypes to check in and check were we actually right in what we were doing. We did this through rapid cross-prototyping and design sprints. And we basically have been iterating it from the prototype to the testing phase for 4 to 5 years now at this point. So this has gone through a lot of testing and checking out to see are we on the right track in terms of this entire design. So through that process, we developed Made to Move, which it works within the university walls, and then further to that, community Made to Move, which works outside the university walls. What was really interesting through the process of design thinking that I called out a moment ago were the themes that emerged from the work that we did. And those themes were around this service model, which came through really strongly from our data. And the words, we created a mnemonic around that, was that it was selfless. So there was something altruistic about doing this because we were asking people to help other people to move more often. It was really easy. You'll see that in a moment when I share the nuances of it. It was very holistic in nature. It was values-led, all about helping other people and trying to try and serve the community in some way. It was highly individual. In other words, helping people on an individual basis and also empowering individuals to help others. Very cheap, actually, very cost-effective. And you'll see that there was an educational component to it as well. So community Made to Move, with this service ethic that was running through it, had a coach overseeing everything, and we worked with the coach to make sure that we had full ethical clearance before we worked with these communities. And their support role basically involved supporting the Move mentors and the Move mentees, those combination peer groups, and also overseeing the gathering of data, and we had a research team then analysing that data. We had a Made to Move training component, which was involving the physical activity part of it and also motivation theory. And that was a 3-hour program. We had the Move mentor, who was the anchor person, who was trained to actually act in that role. And they found a Move mentee to help. Okay, and I'll explain more what happened there in a moment. We had a Made to Move pack, where everybody had a high-vis vest and a water bottle, which was branded, thanks to the work of Caroline and colleagues. And we had this 8-week program where we tracked the step count of those colleagues. And we used social media to track and to try and get the word out there and to try and encourage everybody to keep going. In terms of the methodology and seeing whether this actually worked, if you recall, it was about step count. So we had 17 Move mentees, and we had 17 Move mentors supporting those Move mentees. 82% of those were female, and we used a particular pedometer for these clients, judging the age profile. We felt that this was the best instrument to use. All Move mentors completed a self-administered questionnaire, and the steps were analysed on a weekly basis using descriptive statistics And you can see there that we used a particular SPSS model in terms of the stats analysis. The results, over 88%, or we say 88, I think 0.2% said that they felt sufficiently trained in the 3R program to do what they needed to do. What was really, really fascinating for us was the fact that you had, they were either family or friends, or they were other people were the movementees, which I thought was a really fascinating statistic in terms of who they chose to actually help, which is really, really interesting. So there were always people that were close to them. The other piece was that most of them tried to meet twice a week, and then you can see that there was a certain number of them only managed to meet less than once a week. Time was the biggest obstacle. And what was most exciting, I think, from this point of view is that overall, most of the participants actually managed to actually increase their steps by 1,000 steps per week over that period of time. Now you can see there was a rapid increase in the beginning, it leveled off, but it was quite steady, and we were quite thrilled really over an 8-week period to actually to have that kind of an increase. So in terms of the conclusions, the training was sufficient for the general community members, which is really fantastic to learn that it was actually appropriate. This short social distance was important, and what I mean by social distance in this particular instance is not what we mean by during the pandemic. It's the distance between individuals or social groups in society, and that's not physical. We're talking about relationships here. We saw that they increased their steps by 1,000 steps per week. Technology was not a barrier, and scheduling meetups was actually a difficulty in some cases. And we could really see that service ethic was evident in terms of what was going on here. So we are in the process of pivoting currently, and we are taking into account some of the mega trends in sport and physical activity to do that. And if you want to find out more about the programme, please contact me through any of these avenues. And I'd really be delighted to take any questions at the appropriate time. So thank you so much. And I was timing myself there to try to keep on track, trying my best. So thank you so much.
Fiona. Yes, you were perfect in time indeed. Now, I'd like to ask you in the audience, who has questions first directly to Fiona? Yes, please, Suzanne.
Fiona, thanks for that presentation. I'm just wondering, did you...
Oh, the microphone is coming.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
The measurement of physical activity, so they were using the Omron to only measure physical, like as a black box, or were they using it as a motivational device?
Both actually, both. But what we could only measure in this particular instance was the steps. We didn't measure the motivation to use. That wasn't a question we asked. We purely went from the step count and asked them to report back on that. We did find, Suzanne, that just because of the age profile, you could see a picture of the different the group, the diversity within that, but they were quite an older group, so that was as much as they could manage in this instance, and we felt that was probably the best measure of whether this thing was working or not.
Yeah, we've done studies where, I mean, our data would be similar in that we do two things. One, we use the device as a motivational tool where people can see it, but we independently measure physical activity pre and post, so that we have the black box measurement. And we've shown in 8 weeks that people change by about 2,500 steps, which is pretty consistent with the systematic review evidence. Yep. So that might be something you might want to look at in due course, just as a comparator.
Yeah, that would really be helpful. Thank you for pointing me to that. That's super. Thank you.
Yeah, what I find interesting is that the tool seems to be, the tool meaning that Mi Band in your case, and or maybe you can come up and as well. So the Mi Band in your case, Suzanne, and the step counters in your case, Fiona. How important is that? Like you mentioned, Suzanne, that the people loved it and they really sort of. It was a motivation as it in itself. How was that, Fiona, in your case? How much did the actual step counter help, or how much quality did you, or how much did you invest into quality of that?
It was quite bald in terms of what we gathered there. What we actually saw from the participants was more their engagement as peers, if you get me. It was more the social dimension of what was going on, as well as the steps. So these were people who were supporting each other, who were friends or relations, and as a byproduct of that, they were moving more, if you get me. So that social distance part seemed to be really, really important. And yes, we were measuring steps because it was probably the best indicator of whether the thing was working or not. But there were a lot of other byproducts from the engagement. And just also to point out, there's a few meta things going on in what I've just presented. And one of the meta things is this idea of designing with your community, with, for, and by your community, to see what's the conduit to encourage physical activity, to increased physical activity. So it's not just about, yes, of course, we want them to increase their movement. That's no question. We're trying to do that. But it's almost what did we co-create to allow that to happen or to encourage that to happen. I think that was one of the most, for me, one of the most exciting things about this particular project.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Any more questions?
I had a question for, actually a question for both of you, and I'll maybe start with a question for Suzanne. You kind of hinted towards the fact that you maybe have some outcome indicators of that particular study. I presume there's two outcomes. One is the mental health outcome, and the other one is the actual physical activity outcome.
Yeah. So we measured physical activity, we measured their mental health and well-being, their symptoms, their quality of life, and we also have a process measure. So we measured their changes in motivation to exercise. So the only data we've analysed so far is the activity data, and that's quite interesting because compared to our control group, because I think regardless of the intervention we give people, they improve. We always see that. So what we're interested in is what happens between a group we give an intervention and a control group. And what we've shown is a difference of about 7 minutes per day. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but it works out. That's roughly 50 minutes a week, which is really consistent with some of the big systematic review evidence that that's how much someone would respond to an intervention. So this group, who have lots of cognitive difficulties, some living in residential centres, really challenging population, actually responded really well. Certainly the preliminary findings are that they've responded really well to this intervention.
Excellent. And you had another question.
Yeah, I might even ask two more if that's all right. But one to Fiona is, did you do any long-term follow-up, Fiona? Because as Suzanne kind of said, like most of these interventions, what we see is an increase in physical activity. We're really interested in, 3 months later, 6 months later, 12 months later, have these people maintained the change, or do they go back? Do they regress back to their prior behaviours? Just wonder if you did any follow-up on those communities, or if there's an intention to follow up with them.
There is an intention, and because of the pandemic, we actually were working with the Cork Sports Partnership directly after this, and Caroline would have been involved in that, and we had set up quite an interesting scaling of what we had done. And with the pandemic, it got a bit disrupted, as you can imagine. So there is an intention to do some further work, but we were interrupted because of the pandemic. In fact, what we did in that was we went back to Made to Move on campus, and we ended up running a full online version of this, an entirely virtual version of that, where we have a whole set of data around how do you do this in a virtual setting with no face-to-face. And our data says that it actually works even better, weirdly. It actually worked better online. So in answer to your question, there is an intention to not only look at this again with other groups, but to scale it.
Interesting. And if I can bring myself just one more, so I'm kind of hogging the microphone here. But and this is a question specifically to try and bridge this gap between research and policy, or research and practice, and perhaps an observation from our own learnings of trying to evaluate programs and then trying to advise government policy. So a lot of the results are given on average changes. So on average, steps increase by 1,000 steps or 2,000 steps or whatever it might be. What we found when we start to disaggregate those populations is you've three types of people. You have people who don't change their behaviour, you have people who increase their behaviour, and you have people who reduce their behaviour. And so actually the average isn't really telling you. So that's one thing, first of all, is to try and, I don't know whether you guys looked at that, and what percentage of people actually fit into those three cohorts.
Yeah, we have looked at that. So what we've done is we've looked at if they change, how much of a category do they change? So individual trajectory, and you absolutely will get some people who just go like that or go down a little bit. And I think what we're looking at is some of these interventions you could argue, are quite minimal, and some of these individuals are quite complex. So they probably need a different kind of intervention, and it's really trying to identify who are the people that will respond. And some people will jump, literally they'll be at 2,000 steps and go to 12,000 steps, so you get some huge, so you're right, the averages don't really tell us a whole lot.
Yeah, and I think just to follow on to that, because so I work in the policy space and we're trying to advocate for investment and trying to understand what scale of investment, that question of scale. If we get an idea of what percentage of people who take part in programs, say, go from not meeting national physical activity guidelines to meeting national physical activity guidelines, and let's say it's 10 or 20% of people who take part in programs, then we can say, well, if you want to get 40,000 people more active, you need programs that are reaching 200,000 people, because we know 10 or 20% of them will change their behavior. And all of a sudden you can start having some real informative, discussions about actually how much funding does that cost? What human resource do you need? And so I suppose just that, I think that dialogue between research and policy is really important to make sure the research is speaking the language to transition.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm finished. Thanks.
Very good point, Benny. Are there more questions? No? Fiona, do you have anything to add or want to ask any of you've probably seen the presentations before. Maybe you have a question. I didn't even ask you before.
No, well, what I thought was interesting, first of all, Benny's presentation particularly stood out for me. This rapid increase in numbers to 1 million very recently, and the spike during COVID. I thought that was really interesting. And maybe I want to ask Benny, do you have any data on, I suppose, the nature of that particular, I suppose, the context in which they were doing that walking, that spike that you saw during the COVID period? What do you think was going on during that period that was different to the other times? What was it about that point in time that seemed to encourage more activity?
So what we saw was, first of all population groups increased their levels of walking, but the population group that increased their levels of walking the most were young people. And so what we suspect happened, and this is theory now, we've no proof behind this, but you can imagine most social opportunities stopped. Pubs, cafes, restaurants, shopping was all closed down. All normal sporting activities that these young people were doing at high prevalence rates, kind of 60, 70, 80% of the population in those age cohorts were playing sport on a weekly basis. So all of that activity got displaced, and we suspect it got displaced into, rather than sedentary behaviours, into walking behaviours. And I know, and we're getting into the anecdotes here, but I had friends at the time who were dating, and they were like, it's really weird now. Because you want to go on a date, you go for a walk, and I was like, geez, that's really, you don't go to a pub or a cafe anymore, it's walks on the piers. And so I think a lot of it was driven, we really saw a big increase in young people walking for recreation, which is, although it increased across all population groups, the young people really jumped up. I think that was a big driver. That's how we got to that 78, at one stage 83%, I think was that contribution from young people.
Yeah, thank you. That was one that I just wanted to kind of get the nuances there. And maybe to you, Suzanne, because you're working with a very different population to the one that I'm working with. I'm working with, dare I say it, more mainstream, albeit, different age groups or older age groups. So my question is, could you explain maybe the nuances of the program, maybe the educational components of the program for the participants? What can you comment on it for me? It would be really interesting.
There's a really nice set of materials developed for this population based around the physical activity guidelines. So we would have centred the education programme around that. So I guess a fairly standardised education programme. And then we were using, really, I don't know if you know Susan Mickey's approach to developing interventions, which is based around the behaviour change wheel. We've done a number of these types of interventions in different populations. So really basing it around behaviour change, taxonomy, designed to build people's capability, opportunities to be active, and motivation. So, I certainly can share, we have more detail in our published protocol on the intervention components. But there's a lot of evidence from the general population that these intervention components are effective in supporting people to be more active.
Super. No, that's great. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Any last questions? If not, I'd like to sum up. And what fascinates me over all four presentations today is the importance of the social aspects. Like from the very, I hope you're not disappeared, Fiona. All aspects stress how closely related walking is to the social behavior. Like you just mentioned now, the dating shifted into walking. I think even downtown, most people walk as a group in pairs or several people. That has an impact on how you design the space. And, the numbers are probably influenced by that factor. Mental illness, the device is one thing, but the social aspects of being coached and of being taken care of in terms of walking. And the same with Fiona. She just stressed that there were close relationships, first of all, but then that's exactly the point, that you have that walking is associated in terms of sociability. So did you want to comment any on that? That sort of struck me now as a common ground of all four presentations.
Conscious that we didn't.
Maybe the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we were particularly conscious that we didn't want the occupational therapist or the physiotherapist to continue to be that social support, because if they continued to be the social support, that person was going to be reliant on them. So we're putting in for funding to do a large trial now to actually test effectiveness, but we're really keen to make sure that we signpost or fit in with the fabrics and the structures that are already existing, so that we kind of move people on and they're not dependent on their community mental health team. Because people do recover and they move on and they rejoin hopefully normal life. So, yeah. Yeah.
But they probably still have that social part that goes with them. Yes. So any last comments in this regard?
Just on that particular point, so we do measure, we did a piece of work a number of years ago around how did people get into sport, physical activity. So what was the connection that actually motivated them? Because, a big interest of public policy is, can you run a mass advertising campaign, a social marketing campaign, and get everybody to do more exercise? But actually, when you measure the motivations and the pathways, the journeys that people go through to become physically active, it's all friends and family. And Fiona touched on that earlier on. That it's driven by close social contacts, and Fiona talked about that kind of close social distance. Certainly, the pathway in is largely dependent on that. And to activate people through other pathways is a really big challenge. When you look at actually how few people are motivated by that space, the scale of investment, the scale of social marketing required will be challenged. So I think you're right in that observation that it's a very social construct, the walking and indeed all physical activities, I think.
Thank you. Did you want to come in say something to a last point here?
Yeah, you can expect when the yellow lines that come up, that probably you can expect that people come there to meet also.
Right.
And so that also put a claim on public space to put benches over there, to make people able to sit over there. So that's also what you say, that you can expect those kind of activities in those areas. Yeah. That's exactly what you
Excellent. And Fiona, did you want to comment on that social aspect?
I just think that what Benny said is absolutely right. We tested it. We actually matched people and they ran away from each other. They were physically active, but for the wrong reason, because they didn't want to be together. So the only way it worked is if you trained somebody. If I trained Benny and said, Benny, would you find a friend or would you find a family member to help? That worked, but not the matching, weirdly. We did get them physically active, but not for the right reasons, as I say.
Well, thank you very much to the presenters, all four of them, including you, Fiona, online. Thank you very much for your interesting input and inspiring thoughts. And thank you to the audience for being with us this afternoon. And I wish you a nice evening now. So thanks a lot to all of you.